Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Ishmael story in Genesis chapter 16 in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis 16:1 starts off, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children." That had been the problem ever since we began the Abraham narrative. It had been when those two characters had first been introduced, when we first saw Abraham and Sarai, we were told immediately, and Sarai was barren and had no children, and that's continued up to this point. Abram's wife has borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I will obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. What Sarai is proposing has roots in the cultural traditions of Mesopotamia. We actually have a personal archive. It's a sort of a personal marriage statement or marriage contract from the Nuzi tablets. Nuzi was in northern Mesopotamia, and in this particular tablet, there's a wife named Gilimnenu, and we read that Gilimnenu has been given as a wife to Shenima, he's the husband, as wife. And if Gilimnenu bears children, then Shenima shall not take another wife. You were allowed to have more than one wife, but in this contract, they're agreeing that he's only going to have this one wife. But if Gilimnenu does not bear, then she shall take a slave girl from the Lulu region as a wife, sure, for Shemnina. As for the concubine's offspring, Gilimnenu shall not send them away. And so the deal is, if they have children, then that's going to be their family. But if they don't, then she will obtain a slave girl, and he will have children by that girl, and that will be the legal offspring. And so this was contracted. It was part of the legally binding marriage contract, at least in this case, from that day. And so what Sarai is proposing is something similar, and Abram goes along with it. See, in Genesis chapter 15, that chapter had begun with God coming to Abram with a message. Now it begins with Sarai coming to Abram with some advice. So in both cases, somebody's coming to Abram and giving him some information or advice. In chapter 15, Abram believed the Lord. Here in chapter 16, he listens to the voice of Sarai. He's not disbelieving God, because God hadn't said how the child will come forth, but only that it will come forth through Abram. God hadn't said anything about Sarai. In chapter 15, God gave to Abram promises of protection, of a seed, of the possession of the land. Here in chapter 16, Sarai gives to her husband Abram her handmaiden Hagar in order to fulfill the promise of the seed. She's trying, can I say it this way? She's trying to help God out. In chapter 15, God spoke to Abram and gave him instruction and promises. Here in chapter 16, God speaks to Hagar. We're going to see that in a little bit. And is going to give her instructions and promise. So God's going to show up, but he's going to show up to speak to Hagar. In chapter 15, Abram is promised a son who's going to be his heir. Here in chapter 16, Hagar is going to be promised a son who's going to be a wild man. Verse 3, after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife, Sarai, took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. You see, being pregnant, a woman's ability to do that was a sign of her honor. And Sarai was barren, and so she's dishonored in the sight of Hagar. And just like I've heard, I don't know if it's true, I've heard it said that the ideogram for, at least in Chinese, for the word trouble is putting two women under one roof. Like I said, I don't know if that's true or not, but it ought to be. And that's what takes place here. You have two women, and one is looking upon the other with dishonor. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me." Sarai wants something to happen. Change this. Here's the problem. Do something about it. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Sarai persecutes the slave that is showing her dishonor. It's sort of an unwinnable situation. And the slave Hagar becomes a runaway. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. On the way to Shur, that's actually on the way to Egypt. So Hagar is running home. She's an escaped slave, but she's running home to Egypt. And the angel shows up, the angel of the Lord, and he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, that's her identification, where have you come from and where are you going? Now, I don't think the angel was clueless. I think he's asking her where she might ask herself, what on earth am I doing? And she said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. She's on her way to Egypt, and Hagar has been mistreated by her mistress. I want you to see that there's a correlation here where Hagar has been mistreated by her mistress. This is being written by Moses to the Israelites, who themselves have come out of Egypt after having been mistreated by the Pharaoh of Egypt. She's going to Egypt. They're on their way back out of Egypt. They're in the wilderness. They've come from Egypt. In Hagar's case, she fled into the wilderness. In Israel's case, they escaped from Egypt through the Red Sea and into the wilderness. In Hagar's case, she encounters the angel of the Lord by the spring on the way to the wilderness of Shur. In Israel's case, after they came out of Egypt, and they'd come 3 days journey into the wilderness of Shur. Remember the story where they found no water? Hagar is going through something that Israel also has gone through. Just going in the opposite direction, I suppose. Verse 9, Then the angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress. Now this isn't, we're not reading that Israel is supposed to go back to Egypt, no. But here the angel of the Lord said, Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants. Now, we already saw where Abraham had this promise, and we're going to see eventually that it's going to come through Sarai. But Hagar also has a promise, and the promise given to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord, verse 11, the angel of the Lord said to her further, Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you will call his name Ishmael. Now, the word Ishmael, actually, it's a compound from Shema. Remember how our Jewish friends say the Shema, Hear, O Israel. Shema is the word to hear. You will call his name Ishmael, and the L part refers to God. You will call his name Ishmael, heard by God, because you're going to call him that because the Lord has heard or given heed to your affliction. So it's a play on words. He will be a wild donkey of a man. I'm not even sure how to take that. Except, a wild donkey is sort of impossible to ride. It doesn't conform to cultural expectations. And that sounds like the kind of man Ishmael is going to be. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers. He has a difficult time ahead of him, but he's going to be a wild and free spirit, and so will be his descendants. Then she called the name of the Lord, who spoke to her, You are a God who sees. I love that title for God. He is the God who sees. Now we're going to see that title again later on when we come to the Isaac story, and Isaac is offered on the altar. God will again be, and we're used to translating it, the God who provides, but it's actually the God who sees. And that's how he's called here. You are a God who sees. For she said, I have even remained alive here after seeing him. Therefore the well was called Be'er La'ai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So there's a well there that commemorates a promise given to Hagar. Now I want to contrast a bit Hagar's son versus Abram's heir, because Ishmael's not going to be the heir. Promises are given to him, yes, but he won't be the heir. Hagar's son, his descendants would be innumerable, and we've already read that Abram's going to have an heir, and his descendants are also going to be innumerable, a great multitude. In the case of Hagar's son, he's going to be at enmity with the world. In the case of Abram's heir, his descendants will be a blessing to the world. In the case of Hagar's son, every man's hand will be against him. In the case of Abram's heir, whoever blesses him is going to be blessed, and whoever curses him will be cursed. So there are different promises given. They start off the same, but then there's a division between them. We're reminded in Galatians chapter 4 how we read, and Paul takes this story, and plus a future one that comes in when Hagar and Ishmael are cast out. But here, for it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman, the other by the free woman. But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son by the free woman was born through the promise. This is allegorically speaking. Now, Paul's not saying it didn't really happen. It did. But it serves as an illustration. It serves as a type. This is allegorically speaking, for these women they are two covenants, one proceeding from Mount Sinai, bearing children who are to be slaves. She's Hagar. Now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children, but Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. So here's the distinction, the contrast is between Ishmael and we haven't seen him born yet, but the one who will eventually be Isaac and his descendants. In the case of Ishmael, he represents those who wish to approach God through the law, whereas Isaac, in this representation, represents those who approach God through faith in the Messiah. Ishmael represents, Paul says, the present Jerusalem and Judaism and all those who have denied Christ. Now remember, Paul himself is Jewish, but he hasn't denied Christ. And so he takes Isaac to represent the heavenly Jerusalem, those who are not just Jews on the outside, but those who are also Jews on the inside as well. That is, they have accepted the heavenly Messiah. He takes Ishmael to represent those who were spiritually enslaved, Isaac to represent those who were spiritually free, and he concludes verses 28 and 29 of Galatians 4, and you, brethren, like Isaac, are children of promise. But as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so it is now also. What's taken place is that Judaism, represented by Ishmael, is persecuting, as Paul writes this, is in the process of persecuting Christians, whether Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians. There's a persecution that was going on in his day, and he says it ought not to be. Now, let me just say for the record, it shouldn't go the other way either. The church is never called to persecute Jews, but at this point, what was happening was that Jewish people were persecuting Christians. And he says, the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. Physical Jerusalem isn't going to be the heir. The inheritance is promised to those who are spiritually connected to Jesus through faith, whether they be Jew or Gentile, bond or free, male or female. The physical isn't the issue. It's the spiritual connection that makes all the difference in the world.